Welcome to another episode of M&A in the Trades, where we delve into the intricate world of mergers and acquisitions in the field services industry. I'm your host, Yassin, and today we're going to discuss a critical aspect of any M&A transaction, and that is due diligence. You see, due diligence in M&A is much like that home inspection. It's about looking beyond the surface and uncovering any hidden issues that could turn your dream acquisition into a financial nightmare. And just as you wouldn't buy a house without a thorough inspection, you shouldn't enter an M&A deal without a rigorous due diligence. It's your safeguard against unexpected surprises and your best chance at ensuring a successful transaction. And in this episode, we'll explore why due diligence is so crucial, the common pitfalls that may lead to a failure, and how you can ensure your next deal is a success. So here with me to uncover the secrets to effective due diligence is my amazing co-host, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗠𝗣𝗦. How's it going, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗠𝗧𝗠𝗧𝗠𝗠?
Thank you as always, Yassin. Always good to see you from way across the pond.
Yes, we're bringing global perspective to these episodes, and I'm always grateful for your hard-earned wisdom and lessons from the world of private equity and scaling businesses. So I'm excited to dive into due diligence. Maybe not the sexiest topic, but get this wrong and everything else doesn't really matter. So for you, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗠𝗧𝗠𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 under your belt, with in your own words, why is due diligence so critical?
Well, the obvious thing is it's important to the buyer, which is typically the business that's backed by its private equity sponsor. But set that aside for a second. It's really important to the owner to do the diligence with your prospective buyer too, because you want to see if you're a match. I like to think of diligence. I think my friend Bill, who said this to me once. Diligence is like the dating part of a relationship, right? It is bidirectional, because essentially we're informing the ownership of what the business will potentially look like after close, right? So it's their opportunity to date us, right? See what kind of food we like, see what kind of drinks we like, what kind of
get babies, no babies. What do you want to do?
Yeah, you get it. Yeah, I mean, it's truly an opportunity for the owner to actually see if we're a fit or not a fit, right?
Let's have the tough conversations up front.
Yeah, it totally is. It's it's where the whole idea, because like the acquisition itself is birthed of an idea, like, oh, we can make this fit with our business, and it's all great, and everybody goes out to dinners and everyone's excited, and then you get into diligence, and some eggs get broken in diligence, right? But for good reason, and if you do it right, the output of that is you have an ability to harmonize a business into your platform and both feel good about it. Right?
Absolutely. So can you define, Gyner, the scope of diligence? When does diligence start and when does it end?
Diligence is the way people think about it. Really starts after the initial offer is signed by the owner. So
okay. If you make a soft offer?
Yeah. Typically in a transaction like this, the owner gives us some simple financials about their business. We validate. We don't spend a ton of time, but enough to validate those simple financials. And we say, based on what you've given us this far, here's an offer that we're making as a multiple of your EBITDA, right? And there might be a little back and forthing in there, but not anything material. If they accept it, then diligence starts, right? Okay. Then essentially diligence becomes the output of proving out that valuation is correct on that offer, or if there needs to be adjustments based on what you find in the diligence process. Or honestly, the worst part about it, which doesn't happen that frequently, is you find something in diligence that is detrimental and that you don't want that business, right? So there is that happens very infrequently, just being clear to the audience, but it does happen.
And when does it end? Does it end after like they submit like some financials and you go talk to a few of the employees, or is there like a hard stuff? It's like, okay, you have a certain time frame. Like, how do you think about the period of due diligence? Because you can't be forever doing due diligence and
Yeah.
digging into the business.
It typically runs pretty close to where closing is. Let's just say
Okay.
within a week of closing. You want to try to get most of the major diligence activities wrapped up by about a week before closing. I mean, we'd like to do it earlier, but quite honestly, something always comes up that kind of ties you up in that process. And then there's kind of smaller things that happen all the way to close, right? Not very many, but enough where you've decided these few things about the business, especially things like cash flow, and you want to make
especially things like what? Sorry,
cash flow. Right?
Okay.
That's just an example. You want to monitor that all the way to close, right? Because you're buying some net working capital within the business, and you want to make sure that that's accurate as you close, right?
Right.
But a lot of the work, the heavy lift of diligence, is usually done about a week before close.
Makes sense. And before we get into like maybe break it up step by step, and what's been your shortest due diligence period and longest due diligence period, would you say?
Well, I've been on both ends, right? I've been the seller, I've been the buyer and been sold. On the buyer side, we've done diligence in it usually takes about a month. The short ones,
about a month. Okay.
The average one probably takes about 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
Some of that has to do with the ownership and their ability to match our energy, right? To be fair to the owners, they have an accountant, we have a team. So there's a mismatch on day one, and you have to make sure that you're sensitive to that as you're doing it, right? So typically it takes 2 to 3 months. The longest one was when a couple of times when I was part of an organization being purchased, it took 5-6 months, right?
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And who's typically involved, at least on the buyer side? Who do you involve in your due diligence? Do you have any consultants, any lawyers, any accountants? Is it an internal team? What does the due diligence team looks like?
So yes, to all of that. It really is. You're kind of picking players depending on the deal itself, right? What's constant is you always have some financial. They have an accountant, a CFO, a controller, usually a person, maybe an outside firm helping them as well on the seller side. And then on our side, typically it's the finance team plus the private equity complementing each other, right? That's constant, right? And then you'll bring in a lawyer when you need to review some court cases. And then you'll bring in an HR rep if there's something with people or benefits. So there's specialties you kind of just pull in ad hoc as components. A lot of it is carried by finance. Second group to carry it is operations, which kind of follows the rule of thumb. There's to me, it's a three-legged stool. It's, finance is the financials, operations comes in and really understands how the business runs. And then last is kind of leadership between the two businesses, in the ownership and kind of the acquisition side, really do an assessment of people, right? To understand what the landscape in the organization looks like.
And do you necessarily do it in that sequence, or it all happens in parallel?
No, it happens to some extent in parallel, right?
Okay.
And some of it is less formal. Like the finance process is typically very formal, right?
Yeah.
The operations process and the people process is a little less formal. Now, some of the operations can be formal because you want to really understand, how they sell or how they invoice or something like that. But on the people side, you're really just sitting down and saying, hey, if you don't have a formal org chart, that's cool. Let's sit on a whiteboard and just draw it out.
And map it out.
Who does what, right?
How many businesses you bought didn't have an org chart just for giggles?
Probably 80% of them don't have one.
What?
Yeah,
that's
okay.
Crazy.
It's totally okay.
Okay.
It's totally fine. To me, it's like, let's grab a sheet of white paper and a marker and let's just write it out, right?
And let's write off 2% of.
Yeah. What's more important is that we understand what they do than who they report into, because at some point you're going to learn that anyway. I just want to know what they do, right? So that I can respect that and make sure that we understand the boundaries and what that person feels is important to their role, so that when we close, we don't really go in there and essentially tick off the dispatcher who's super critical to a certain account because we think differently of a dispatcher than they think of themselves.
Exactly. That's interesting. And how sensitive is it? And what I mean by that is, are you primarily talking to the executive or the owner? Are you going on site, visiting the site, talking to the technicians? How hush hush is it? Is the process, or who's your primary point of contact on the seller side?
It really depends on the owner and seller themselves, right? Some of them are pretty open about it, they've told their organization they're selling, so it's a little less walk on eggshells. Some of them we've done diligence offsite at like a hotel or something like that, totally away from their business, where it's the owner, a finance person, and maybe one operations person that's aware, right? So there's a little bit of a mixed bag in there. I like the owners that have already kind of prepped the organization for the sale,
culture,
because it takes a lot of stress off the buyer side of the people management piece, which can get really complicated. Because essentially, if you're a seller and you're listening to this, the number one piece of advice I can give you is prepare yourself to have that conversation with your organization before you go sell, right? Because what happens, the narrative your teams start to write as soon as we close and we announce, and we do it all in good spirit. I have never been part of an acquisition where we walked in the door to clean house, right? What happens is those employees, your employees as a seller that are now our employees as a collective team, get a sense of being like betrayed. It's not true, but how they think about it, right?
How they feel about it,
That's how they feel about it, right? I've been betrayed. You pulled one over on me. You sold out to the band, right? All the narratives, start to come out because you didn't prepare them for the fact that, hey, this is part of my exit strategy as an owner. This is what I've been building for, 20 years of my life, and my kids don't want to do it anymore. So I have to do something with it to extract the value of this business, right? If you're not thinking and starting to prep the organization for that, I would say, if you take one thing away as a seller from this call, if you listen to this, start to think about what your plan is to talk to your organization.
I love that. And maybe this is a whole episode where we talk to an owner who exited the business and learn from their experience how they prep their company and their employees for sale. I think that's a very, very critical topic. So great. I'm going to ask you for 3 tell signs that what you bought is not exactly what you thought it was, even after rigorous due diligence. Or rather, during due diligence, it's that what they said that they're selling is not exactly what ended up being. What are some what are the 3 top tell signs that this is not what you want to buy? It's not a business you want to buy.
So you're saying in diligence, 3 things that would tell me maybe this is not a business we want to close.
Yes. Yeah.
It's in the same 3 groups, by the way, right? The 3-legged stool I gave you.
Yes.
One is in the financials, you find something, and something could be how they collect cash, how they put money in the bank, how they pay their bills or not pay their bills. You find something in there that's material. By the way, it's not like they forgot to pay an invoice and it's just behind. It's, hey, we pay all of our invoices 30 days later than they're due. And it's like, well, let's talk about that and why you do that, right? And why we can't do that and the implications on our cash to do that going forward, right? On the operation side, what would tell me is like if I'm sitting there and the owner says, "Oh yeah, I'm just here for 4 hours a day and I don't really do anything," red flag, right?
Why?
For me is a red flag.
Why?
Because what I learned in one of the deals we did in my past company was it may be 4 hours a day, but they're an air traffic controller, right? That's the analogy I give you. They come in, they make sure all the flights don't hit each other, they make sure everybody sticks on schedule, and then they leave, right? And that's what the owner does. Make sure all the money gets in the bank, make sure customers get taken care of, make sure bills get paid. And they dictate to people what to do, right? And that layer beneath them has not been empowered or trained to operate on their own, right? So now you unplug this owner and the whole thing blows up because they don't know what to do. They don't have anybody to tell them anymore, right? So that becomes a red flag for me. The third, a little bit of a red flag, it's not don't do the deal, it makes me dive in more, is when they start to say, you can't talk to so-and-so until I tell you to.
It makes you want to talk to them more. I want to talk to that guy or gal.
I'm like, well, why? Like, well, they don't know and I want to have a chance. I'm like, hey, great, let's sit at the table together and talk to them. Well, no, you can't do that. Well, no, I need to do that because they work for us collectively, not you anymore, right? So we have to sit at the table together. So those are like red flags for me where I have learned my lesson the hard way about kind of sitting down and really understanding more about these businesses.
That's interesting. Have you had the situation where you decided not to move forward because maybe not they misrepresented their numbers, but they just their financial their accounting system is a mess, and they didn't have a really good data, and then you had to like completely revise your offer and then walk away from the deal because just the numbers didn't make any sense. Have you ever walked away from a deal because of financial data not being represented? Okay.
I had a deal, I think it was back in 2018, and we were looking at it, and this business was doing like 15 million top line. I think it might have even been a little more. I might have my numbers a little off, but and I remember we were going through a diligence process, and one of our finance leaders internal to the team, brilliant young guy, like had done some simple analysis and walked up to me and he says, these guys are only making like a couple $100,000 on that 15 million. Like, what? And he had done a really nice job. Like, he had laid out their costs and some of the inefficiencies in their business and their inventory disaster and all this other stuff. And he's like, my best guess is this is I think it was $250,000, EBITDA business on 15 million revenue, like stuff. And maybe there was a little more with owner costs added back in and stuff, but you're buying basically nothing. Because look, when you're buying a couple $100,000, you're not really buying a business, right? Because you are one bad decision away after close of losing money, right?
Wow.
So we walked from that deal, right?
Wow.
We ended up, I remember walking in and talking to Bill and saying, hey, I think we should do this. And he and I had a really good discussion, and he brought the finance guy in, and Bill is much better than I am at the finance side, so he's much more senior than I am. But he listened and he's like, yeah, we're not doing this deal.
Yeah, wow. So, Gyner, so walk me through your diligence process. So I signed, let's say I'm the seller. I signed, and maybe bring back the last deal you did, and we can break it down. So I just, you made me a soft offer. I gave you some financials, the numbers look good, and I signed the letter of intent, right? Is that it? And an NDA. Is there an NDA I sign, or we both sign mutual
Typically
NDA?
It's a non-disclosure. Yep, and letter of intent.
Yes, and great. So now it's the day after. I'm excited. This could be a really good deal for both of us. What do you need from me?
typically there is a standard list, a request list that comes out of documents, mostly financial, some operational, and some people, those 3 buckets, right? And when I say these, by the way, there's, people say, well, what about sales and what about human resources? Assume a version of some of those are embedded in those 3 buckets.
Yeah, you bucket them. Yeah.
And we send that over to the owner, and the owner says, first, I think they say, because I've talked to some of them after we bought them, they do a little bit of a holy
shit. What's that?
Yeah. And hey, it's your recording, so I didn't want to say the words. I'm glad you did. You're the host.
Hey, it's your podcast, so that's fine.
So we, they do a little bit of that, and typically they'll call me or the CEO or something like that and say, are you guys like serious about this? And they're like, yeah, why not? Like, oh my gosh, like we don't have all this stuff, and half of this we don't have. So what usually happens right after they get the list and the shock and awe factor starts to wear off is, what can you get within each one of these items? Get us that, and we'll determine whether or not it's good enough, right?
And what's typically the toughest line items on that list to get?
Usually it's something to do with historical financials, because they just never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they didn't need to, right? They're an entrepreneur, really owner-led, well-run business. If he closes books every 6 months, he's fine with it, right?
Right.
Because he didn't have a need. Money in the bank, he made payroll, everything is good. All their customers were happy, right? There's nothing wrong with that business model, but we need financial statements because we're trying to understand history
and how far back are you looking for?
Typically 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
Sometimes more, depending on.
Not too bad. Yeah.
I mean, if your valuation expectations are higher, we might go back as far as 5, right?
Right, because you want to see that consistency.
Yeah, because you want to see that consistency over time. So, I mean, that's difficult for them, right? Because they just don't have it. And then a lot of times what we do in our businesses is we've created KPIs for what we consider successful businesses like ours run. And then we go to the owner and say, hey, tell us what your utilization or billable versus pay time looks like. And the owner says,
I don't know.
I don't track that.
I don't track that.
I don't track that at all. So then it's like, well, can you pull your payroll files of hours for the last 6 months and pull your billed hours?
So you can put it together.
We'll have one of our finance guys do the analysis, right? So that gives you a sense, a little bit of how that process goes through. The other thing is, like, you and I were joking a little earlier about the org chart thing. Like, they don't have an org chart. When you start to say to them, hey, like, show me all your people and what they do, right? It's like, I don't even think about that. And there's like, well, there's 50 people in your organization, and I need to know what they all do, because they're going to be 50 people in our organization in about a month, right? So that ends up being an exercise too. Like, it takes them a couple of days to type it up, or something like, here's these 5 people are dispatchers. These are senior techs who've been here for 10 years. They're also trainers, and they have other roles. You start to kind of learn all that, and that takes a while, because they're not ready for it.
Interesting. So that covers the financial and operational. What are you exactly looking for in operational?
Do they have customer contracts? No, or pricing agreement. I'll call them pricing agreements, right? Do you have pricing agreements? Do you have contracts? What are they? Can you get them to us so we understand them? Do you have some kind of buying agreements with suppliers? What does that look like? What are your commitments? We need to understand the dynamics of all that in operations. Do you have in operations some unwritten agreements with some of your operations teams that we need to know about, right? You give a $50 kickback for every 5 service calls they run. Like, you need to know that stuff, because it's important for us, because we may not be able to do that, but we can do something to substitute for that with the employee post-close, right? So those are the type of questions you start to get into to a real level of detail within operational diligence.
And how much from an operational perspective, Gear, like do you also assess like the IT system? What you know?
Oh yeah.
What?
Yeah, just assume we're doing all that. To us, that's table stakes. Like, what is the infrastructure stack? What is your security, which usually isn't very much. And what kind of devices do your people use? Do you buy them? Do they buy them themselves? We go through all of that. Like, what's your technology? What's your CRM? What's your ERP? If anything, most of these businesses are on QuickBooks on the back end, right?
Yeah.
Really more the front end you're focused on. But yeah, I mean, we go through all those exercises with them.
And I guess part of that would be the commercial due diligence, right? Their the growth potential in their market, the customer base, the sales pipeline, all of that, their sales force. How critical is commercial diligence for you, Gyner?
I don't know that commercial. When you say commercial diligence, I assume you mean revenue generation activities.
Yes.
For me, that's
go to market.
What I really want to understand is what is the sustainability of their growth, right? Because most of these businesses are small enough where they don't really have a commercial sales approach.
Right.
What we want to understand is what they're doing, can it carry through for a period of time until we can help them get a commercial sales approach?
Okay.
Or do they have something that's more scalable for the entirety of the organization? And that's what you're trying to understand. What we want to make sure is it's not a business that's built on a bunch of one-timers, and you're kind of hoping that post-close they continue to behave the same way that they're behaving right now.
Got it.
Because they won't. Hint.
Right.
They will not.
Yes. And are these businesses typically like what, growing at single digit, year over year growth?
There's like different variants. We've bought businesses that are declining that need help. We've bought
from a revenue perspective, revenue growth.
I mean, there's businesses we've purchased that are 20. I think one of the most successful businesses we bought was 25-30% a year, right?
Ooh,
so
organic.
Yeah,
nice.
The more typical ones, the sweet spot businesses are the ones that are organically growing in that, let's just say 9 to 15% range, if you can find them. And they're doing it over the course of 3 to 5 years pretty consistently. Those are the businesses where you're like, there's something there, because they're not going to get lucky that often.
Yes. Okay. That's beautiful. All right. So that covers operational due diligence. So talk to me about the people side. And when you say people, does that include like cultural due diligence, where you're looking at, churn data, you're looking at employee satisfaction, employee net promoter score,
they don't have any
logs.
They don't
none of that.
They have none of that. I'll be happy if they have a training log, right? To start the conversation.
Oh wow.
How do you train your people? Can you show us that, right? One of the questions I always ask is, if you left tomorrow, not that you're going to, but if you left tomorrow, who are the key people in the organization that we shouldn't mess with, right?
Right. Very important.
How many of those people are? Because they know who they are. They'll tell you.
Right.
They'll say, oh my gosh, she's been here for 20 years. She knows all these top customers. She makes sure we get paid on every invoice. Check. I know that now, right? That's the kind of conversation we want to have with them, because we don't want to misstep or create a minefield in ourselves. Like, we walk in the door like, we're better than you, and we can collect on, this McDonald's owner operator, because guess what? We have a relationship with McDonald's. Well, as soon as you pull the plug on that person, you lost the relationship that you didn't even know, and that's worth something to the organization, right? So we have some real detailed conversation on like who the critical pieces are in the organization that we need to be aware of. And frankly, we do the flip side too. Like, hey, potentially, if you could wave a wand, who would you get rid of? Because there might be a way for us to do that, right?
Right.
So we have both those conversations with the ownership group.
And do typically owners stipulate that you can't get rid of anyone? Have you had these type of deals?
There's going to be HR professionals that listen to this that say that, the answer is no to that. The answer is maybe. we have to get some legal advisement on it, and it's case by case is what I'd say. But sometimes you can. Sometimes you can say, hey, at close, if you don't think that person brings value, they don't come with the deal, right? I haven't seen it often happen, just to be very, very clear. But you have to have the discussion, even if if it only happens 1% of the time, you still have to have the discussion, right?
Yeah, because you're never going into a deal thinking, okay, who am I going to let go? If you're thinking about going into a deal and the first thing you want to do is get rid of people, you're probably not buying a great business, right? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not looking for broken businesses, you can fix them. You're looking for a good business you can make great. You're not, business.
Hey, look, this is a private equity podcast. There are private equities that are very successful in having theses of buying distressed businesses, turning them around, and making them success stories.
Okay.
I will not profess to be an expert in that. So setting that aside, my approach is to go buy great businesses, bring them together, and make something greater, right? That is the perspective I have in terms of how I approach it.
I love it. All right, so to wrap this up, today with over 20 acquisitions, Gyner, you are, I'd like you to give an advice to a CEO of a new platform, who's making their first acquisition. What advice would you give the CEO? And what advice would you give an owner who also it's their first exit, in terms of what to look for in due diligence, or what's your one advice to a new CEO going into their first acquisition, and what's your advice to an owner going into due diligence?
Same advice for both roles.
Okay.
Ask the question that's in your head that you don't want to ask. Because if you don't ask it, it's going to come up, and one or both of you are going to end up having a friction point right after close that you could have solved up front in the diligence process. Ask the question. If it's in your head, it's in your head for a reason, because something that's happening in the diligence process has caused that question to come up, right? So ask it. Now, be constructive, be tactful, do it in the right way for sure to be constructive, but ask the question. And both of them, same advice. Ask the question, because you want to be at ease that when you get to close, most, if not all, of the questions that you have in your head and on paper on that list that we send you have been checked off to a reasonable extent, right? So ask the question.
I love it. And maybe we can work on putting together a due diligence checklist. We'll call it the Osgood checklist, and share it with our audience. Huh?
The Go checklist.
The Go checklist. I love it. And there you have it, Gyner. As always, amazing insights, and it just speaks volume to how critical it is to do proper due diligence, because it's all in this process. If you buy the wrong business, whether it's the financials don't line up, the operation doesn't line up, or more importantly, the people don't line up, it's hard to turn it around post acquisition. And I'm curious, if you're listening to this podcast, what are some of your takeaways from this episode? And maybe if you have your own secrets to due diligence, please share them with us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, or you're interested in joining the next step, feel free to reach out to me or comment on this episode. If you want to get more involved, I'd like to invite you to our upcoming M&A roundtable, where Gyner and I and other experts in the field will talk about the problems, the solutions, the opportunities that's happening during an M&A. So if you'd like to join us on that M&A roundtable, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get you an invite. That's all for now. Until the next episode, Gyner, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, guys.